Welcome to the Wellbeing Uprising, the podcast that shines a light on the real challenges and opportunities in workplace wellbeing. Today we're exploring burnout, not just the clinical endpoint, but the grey zone so many leaders and teams inhabit. On the edge, recovering, or cycling back again. Our guests bring both lived perspective and an employer lens. I'm joined by Herb Kim, a long-time tech and events founder, who believes he's been regularly in a state of or on the edge of burnout.
I was actually probably denying that I was in burnout and trying to pretend, everything's fine, because on the outside, everything is fine, you know?
And James Katirai from NEL Fund Managers, an employee-owned investment firm, speaking about what companies can practically do to help people avoid burnout and perform sustainably.
And I think you've got to be really careful that you're not creating a culture where people are continuously having to go above and beyond.
So Herb, you've led high pressure, high visibility events for years, from Thinking Digital to TEDx. How do you manage the stress behind that? Is that been quite a challenge?
It's a massive challenge. Yeah. I was bred to be an organizational person. So whether it be in a university or a big company or a profession, I had a very conservative sort of educational background, and that's all my peers are either in banks or in law or professors and things like that. So doing something entrepreneurial was really never in any of my training. So doing that, I think that fundamentally it's been very different. But I think it's also been super rewarding. And I have an actual MBA from the Wharton School in Philadelphia. But my real MBA, my real life MBA was in setting up my own company sort of 15 years ago, and figuring out how do you actually survive in business outside of large organizations.
You've been really open though around skirting on the edge of burnout as well.
Yeah.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, by open, I don't talk about it that much, but when people ask, as you did, I think for many years, I would say I've either actually been in burnout or struggling with on the edges of it. And then, very, very occasionally have, brief periods where I feel like, it's everything's sorted and like I'm fully present and able.
Yeah. I mean, when you are running big events like that and you're working towards deadlines, you will be running on spikes of adrenaline. And I'm sure that contributes to that. What does it feel like in terms of day to day when you do feel like you're on that verge of burnout?
It's equivalent to a kind of personal neutron bomb has gone off, where the person is still here. I can go to things. I can look normal. I don't look burnt out, but I'm not really present. Certainly not in responding to professional pressures, and professional pressures can be reading an email. Like if I think, this email looks like it could be something meaty, I'll just conveniently, open it in another time, which another time could be weeks later, sort of thing. So that's that loss of, I guess, what you might call executive function is like the most obvious sign that there's something not right.
Yeah, it is a really big challenge. And it was actually the reason that I founded Optimi, because a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders were telling me that they were feeling burnt out. So you're certainly not alone. But I think the key question is, how do we do what we need to do without the expectation that we will burn out at some point? Is there a way that you navigate around this now, or is this something that you're still learning about?
I'm still learning about it. Seemingly every season, let's say. I'm not sure what the. So I mean, there's all the standard advice that I think I have followed about. Obviously, things like sleep and exercise and diet and things like that. But one thing that I tried this summer that I feel like has made something of a difference is it only seems relatively recently that the standard model of advice includes sun exposure. And so I just made a habit of going out in the sunlight every day for about an hour, just walking around. So, and whereas before I would do my exercise either early in the morning or late at night. I would go to the gym at literally 10 p.m. and close it down, sort of thing, as the most efficient time for me to doing that stuff, when actually I probably would have been much better off trying to squeeze it in at lunchtime, just because then you're obviously getting some sun exposure at the same time. So yeah, I feel like, and that's literally just this summer. I mean, I'm 58, so at 58 years old, I figured out, sun exposure might be able to help out a little bit. So yeah, learning all the time for sure.
Yeah, but you know what it is? I think a lot of these things we do know, but because we're so busy day to day, it's difficult to fit it into our daily lives. And it is about building healthy, sustainable habits, because when you are so busy, these are the things that just fall off track, aren't they?
If I don't get up and go to the gym in the morning, I feel terrible for the rest of the day. It's like a pattern, a routine where it helps me switch on as a person, as an individual. Yeah. It used to be I had to get up and have a shower before the gym, and luckily I managed to cut that out because I was showering at like 4:30 in the morning, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah. And sometimes you just need to take a moment to step back and reflect on, what does your lifestyle look like at the moment, and what changes can you make. It's really interesting though that you mentioned sunlight, because our previous episode with Nicole, who's a sleep expert, she was saying how important it is that you get outdoors and have at least 20 minutes outside to help sleep as well. So that is really interesting. Yeah. James, from your perspective, so obviously you come from an organisation, why do you think burnout isn't just an individual priority, but an organisational one as well?
Well, particularly within the financial services industry, a lot of it is based on trust and being able to make decisions that are in the interest of both businesses and individuals. So from our point of view, it's really important that the individuals within our organization have full focus, are able to make educated, rational decisions when they are bringing lending opportunities and when they're discussing opportunities with clients. Our investment execs need to get into the granularity of a business, but also have the interpersonal skills to really get to understand the business and the individuals behind it fully.
So NEL is quite unique as an employee-owned organisation. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that sets it apart in terms of wellbeing and culture?
With an employee ownership trust, everyone has an equal stake and shareholding in the business. That means that everyone who, we're making this decisions based on the 16, 17 people within the organization, the people who sit next to you, the people who work across from you. And ultimately, we're not looking at creating faraway shareholder value. It's about making decisions that will help the people on the ground who are working in the business day to day.
Yeah. So I delivered a workshop recently about burnout, and at the end there's often a Q&A. One of the questions that came through was, what do I do if my manager isn't taking burnout seriously? And
is that from one of my colleagues?
No. Completely different organisation, but it'd be interesting to just hear your perspective on why you think that might occur. And Herb, you might have some thoughts on this as well from your experience working in different organisations.
There's probably a few different things there. The manager himself is probably under quite a lot of pressure and is prioritizing panic and short-termism, whereas they need to look at a longer-term strategy around how individuals are being tracked, because ultimately that will drive long-term performance. When you take a short-term strategy, you will drive bad behaviors, I think. And you need to be discussing with employees around what that looks like longer term. And if there is a drive to hit an immediate target, making sure you put in place kind of safeguarding procedures to help those individuals, so it doesn't become the norm of stretch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, I have worked in a lot of larger organizations like IBM and O2 and places like that. And it does happen clearly. I think for me, one of the nice things I think out of running a small business is, we're constantly pushing, everyone's being pushed, right? But so I do actually I have to actively be mindful of, pushing too hard and realizing, oh, okay, this, like just lay off for a bit or check in to make sure that the people working with me aren't either being stretched too hard or that I'm doing real damage to the relationship. So it's I think there's a couple of things. One is that I do think that like managing your burnout is first and foremost your own responsibility. And of course, you don't want to have toxic, if you're in a toxic situation like that, where you're constantly being pushed over, that you should hopefully have the freedom to go look for another job or, complain with eternity, whatever sort of thing, if you will. But I think the first thing is just, that there are going to be times if you're in an ambitious organization that, that we're all going to be pushed, and that, there will be times that you get pushed too far, if you will. Right. But I think I would just say that just make sure that you're managing yourself first. And if it gets so bad and so chronic, then you got to do something or say something. But
sometimes you have to be brave and actually kind of stand up for yourself and have the conversation to the wider team, the person you're working for, whoever it is, and say, oh, I need this. But again, you're right. Ambitious organizations, there are going to be pressure points. If I look at NEL, we're a small organization. We're trying to grow rapidly. There's going to be times where we'll have to go above and beyond. One of the things we've got is a time off and lose system where, so if I work late tonight, I can claim the hours back, essentially. And that's a massive benefit, because particularly in the finance community, there's a lot of, evening activities, networking events, those sorts of things, where if you want to go out, develop relationships, develop business, you have to be there to kind of show face and build those connections.
So the World Health Organization classifies burnout as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. So it has been recognized as this. And I think we need to take burnout right back to when stress becomes unmanageable. Do you have anything in place that helps people to recognize when somebody gets to that point? Perhaps it's training, developing awareness around stress and burnout.
Personally, I try to use one-to-ones with my team to understand how they're doing with workload, how they're doing outside of work. You never know the pressures that people face on an individual basis, because some people might be very quiet and want to keep it to themselves. Some people might be a lot more forthcoming. So I think transparency and having that conversation and knowing that making people know that they can come to you if there's an issue is the key thing. We also try to manage the workload across the team. So in terms of deal flow, rather than them all going to one individual, we'll look to spread it out. We have agile working to try and reduce travel time, etc.
Through a lot of these podcast episodes, what's come out is culture and the ability for people to open up and show vulnerability. But in some organizations and some sectors more specifically, things like stress, unfortunately, can still be seen as a sign of weakness. How do you think organizations can overcome that? And is it more challenging in the much bigger organization, much larger organizations?
I mean, I've worked for two banks. One was the biggest bank in the country with 100,000 plus employees. You might want to fact check that, but I'm pretty sure it's around that level. I then moved on to a challenger bank, which had around 4,000 employees. And now I'm in a business that has 17 employees. The level of care and compassion in a small organization like NEL has massively outweighed anything I've seen in a larger corporate. And I think that is because, the CEO sits next to you, the HR department sits next to you. Everyone is one in a team and knows each individual intimately within the business. When you go into a larger organization, it's, those functions are removed.
And Herb, from a leader's perspective, so you're a leader in the tech industry and amongst entrepreneurs as well. Do you think it's important for leaders and entrepreneurs to be more open about burnout?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think people should, they should be. I guess, you know, I guess what I like to do is talk about what I'm doing about it versus just saying I'm really stressed, I'm really burnt out, I'm really this, that, other thing. Which I understand there are times for that. That is probably a time for a private conversation with a professional, with your family, with friends, that sort of stuff. In my opinion, I mean, I'm not an expert in this sort of thing. So when I talk about it, I do try to talk about it in the context of things I'm doing, like I'm committing to getting an hour of sunlight every day, or I'm doing cold showers and ice baths, or whatever. So yeah, it's real, and I mean, as well. I mean, if it's that bad, then you can always change life, right? And that's another option. So I'm choosing to do what I do, and part of that is that it is by its very nature very stressful, and so and I have certainly thought of multiple times along the way of how do I pull the escape cord on this, but I haven't, because obviously something keeps on bringing me back. Well, that's just the price you pay.
Yeah, it is interesting because at a panel event, was it last week or the week before with NEL? So roles were reversed. I was asked if I'd ever considered that myself as an entrepreneur. And then last week I was asked by a student who is going into setting up a business, how do they manage burnout? And I think the key challenge when you are just starting out in business is that you almost have to be a jack of all trades, because you can't quite afford the marketing team, the sales team. You have to understand everything. Mm-hmm. So it can be a real challenge around where do you put that energy and that focus, or really understanding where your key strengths are so that you can eventually outsource the other aspects. James, it'd be really interesting from your perspective around when you make those investments in those entrepreneurs, do you take a look at how they might manage their well-being?
I think overall, one of the things you're thinking about is the structure of their business, and a lot of it comes down to key man risk. So yeah, essentially we are looking at how they're managing their well-being, because if they break down for whatever reason and can't function and do and have that clarity of thought, then that's a massive problem. Because when we, particularly on the smaller loans fund, they're often, they are very young businesses with smaller management teams. Like you say, you'll have to be a jack of all trades. So have they got structure around them? Have they got people to support them? We have a portfolio function that will work with them on an ongoing basis. So if there are things like that, or they need to develop the finance function, for example, then we'll work with them to support in that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I personally think as a business community, we should be quite open in terms of what is burnout, what does it look like, you're not alone, how do we manage it, what works for each individual, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to that panel event that you kindly took part in for NEL last week, it was really refreshing to see the honesty of you, Sam, and Joanne during the Q&A and the panel, because you all talked about challenges that you'd faced as female founders, and they're found across the board, but there is always a hesitation to say I need help here or I need help there. One of the things I try to do with my team is be open and honest. If I've got a weakness, I highlight it and probably joke about it. And there's a lot of personal self-reflection around how you can improve. Little tricks like getting your hour of sunlight, or I always want to do the cold water piece, but I have not got the gumption for that, unfortunately.
I tried it once.
I keep on looking at it and think, oh yeah, that sounds great, and then push comes to shove, I'm like, absolutely not. Boiling hot shower.
There's a menu of different ways for well-being.
Yeah.
So that happens to be one that I've chosen. But,
yeah. Well, it could be walking the dog, having a chat to a friend,
exactly.
whatever it needs to be. A mentor. Mentors have been key in my career in terms of if I have got a challenge, speaking about it.
Yeah.
People I've worked with in the past, I continue to mentor myself just to try and give them that sounding board to check that the kind of saying and what have you.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I wanted to come onto the podcast, in addition to getting to spend time with you both, was just because I think burnout is something that just people need to be aware of more. I certainly didn't think of burnout. I didn't think of myself as someone that was susceptible to burnout until it happened. Certainly if you are taking on a management or leadership responsibility of an organization of any size, it doesn't have to be CEO of Shell or something like that. You could become a freelancer. That's going to be a potentially much more stressful existence. And I think one of the things, especially if you are a leader of an organization, is that it's not even so much about what you're doing or your energy, your your motivation, all that sort of stuff is a huge part, probably the majority of the value you're actually adding to whatever organization that you are leading. And because once the burnout hits, it's almost then, just because it's so unpredictable as to how long it's going to take you to get out of burnout, that you really do have to be super mindful. And I certainly wasn't until it happened to me. And then it was like, holy crap, like it was almost I was actually probably denying that I was in burnout and trying to pretend, everything's fine, because on the outside, everything is fine, But, and I was also mentioning about how, you do typical things like, dry January. I did dry January as hopefully a solution to that. I went through the whole month. No problem. Got through the whole month, etc. Got all the benefits of it that you would expect. Lost weight, better sleep, but I was still burnt out at the end. I was still not dramatically more productive by the end of this period.
Yeah.
So it's it's a dangerous amorphous thing, and you just got to be mindful about it, that it can hit you, and then getting back out of it, who knows?
Yeah. And I think when you think of the burnout cycle as well, it's you take on more than you can cope with. You develop stress, then it develops into chronic stress, and then you hit burnout. So it's like you said, it's having that self-awareness of at what point are you at. And sometimes when people get to the chronic stress phase, that used to feeling stressed, that it's just become normal. That feeling has become normal. So really taking the time to think, like, how am I coping, like physically, mentally, and emotionally, is so important.
Yeah.
James, interested in your perspective on how managers could potentially create burnout conditions accidentally.
I think I mentioned earlier around making kind of stretch the norm. And I think you've got to be really careful that you're not creating a culture where people are continuously having to go above and beyond, and making that the norm and making that the expectation level. People shouldn't be expected to work longer than they have to. Obviously, there's going to be cases where when there's a business need. You talked about young businesses looking in high growth environments earlier. There will be a need to work longer hours, but things like the toil system that we've got in place, where they can claim the hours back, is a massive help. So, they can.
Toil system.
Yeah, sorry,
Nice.
Time off and lieu. So
Nice.
essentially,
Okay.
if they work 4 hours later, they can claim 4 hours back.
Nice.
At a point that suits them in the business. And that works well because it buys you as an employer a bit of leeway and a bit of goodwill. But for the employee, it means that they can take the kids into school or, have an afternoon off in half term without using holiday.
Yeah. And stretch is important because we want to be able to push ourselves.
Absolutely.
And we want to achieve. So stretch is important. We can't just always sit in our comfort zone. So stretch is important, but it's identifying when it's gone from stretch to strain, isn't it? And being able to normalize that conversation around it.
I mean, look, with stretch, you'll generally be pretty focused, and there'll be an end in sight with a clear goal in sight. Strain is when it's, a lot more longer term and less focused.
Yeah. What do you feel about the role of technology in terms of help, hindrance, bit of both?
Look, it absolutely both. hindrance in the respect that I've got my emails on my personal phone, and it's impossible. Well, it's not impossible to ever switch off, but it's a lot harder to switch off. I mean, I am a bit pedantic with it. If I went away on holiday, I'd rather check them rather than knowing I'm coming back to, a situation that is got out of hand. And I'd rather clear them down than have 1,000 when I get back. But some people are the opposite and feel that it's a bit intrusive. In terms of it being a good thing, you can use it to manage diaries. You can use your AI to speed up certain tasks. You can use it to have focus time, etc., etc.
Yeah, for me, I mean, ironically, since I run a conference called Thinking Digital, I'm literally last week, I had a freak out because I just realized I think I hate Slack. And I just told everyone I am no longer going to be using this. I'm going to be shutting it off as a default. If you need to call me, that's my number one thing is call me, right? Because I think the thing about someone calling someone is that it actually requires some discipline upon the caller to think about what, first of all, is this worth bothering somebody about, right? Secondly, how do I need to communicate in a way that's effective and clear, right? Whereas Slack and other electronic communication, you effectively just drop a work bomb on someone's head sometimes, right? And then the thing that's worse about email is there's a culture on email that says you can get to it when it's appropriate for you. You don't expect if I email you now, I don't expect an answer within 5 minutes, right? Whereas with Buddy Slack, there's a whole culture around bing bong, the Slack things going off that you got to pay this, you got to pay attention to now, and that you're supposed to actually come back with some sort of meaningful answer as well, right? And of course, you don't always have to. I'm sure there are plenty of Slacks that go ignored or unanswered sort of thing, but there's certainly culture around that. And so I think really thinking about how you consume technology. I mean, it's just, we had a talk recently for TEDx Manchester that made it to TED.com. It was all basically about how to have better conversations. And I was like, it was incredibly effective. It was an incredibly good talk. I mean, if we're still figuring out how to speak to each other, which we've been doing since humans existed, it's no wonder that we're having challenges managing technology, which is obviously a far newer medium. And something I realized, wow, I really, again, this is like Burnout. I just thought I can just take in all this digital stuff no matter what. I'm open to everything, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Slack, whatever. And I realized, actually, hold on for a second. I've got to actually figure out what's right for my workflow.
It's just so easy to lose the tone of what you're trying to say as well. I used to manage it until recently. I managed a football team outside of work, and communicating with players, there was a tendency for them to contact you via WhatsApp at all hours asking X, Y, and Z. It's much easier to have a phone call though, and you can box the points off quicker. You don't lose the tone, and they can't keep on coming back to you.
Anything with nuance, what I've particularly hated in Slack is someone wants that we need to make some sort of decision about something creative, whether it be design or marketing or whatever, and they'll be like, here's 4 different executions of this thing, and can you give feedback? And I just, why didn't you just call me? It'd be so much faster to have this conversation. And so figuring out just what is the appropriate channel for X communication, I think is definitely part of it. And I'm sure for certain people, again, depending on your thinking style, leaving yourself open to tons of ping pong notifications and whatnot is almost certainly going to be adding to your potential burnout risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm looking at when we've negotiated investments recently, the best negotiations were either done face to face or over the telephone, verbally, because you can get quick responses. You kind of riff in between yourselves to get to the best answer, rather than coming back with 20 points, me going back with 20 points, and so forth.
Yeah, also, again, the nuance, because I'm sure someone will give you an answer to something, and they may say yes, and then by the tonality of how they said yes, you can pick up, do they really mean this or not? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. I also think it's the time as well, because you've got your own to-do list. that you're probably working through, and then you've got these notifications coming back and forth, and it's not just the time of reading them and replying, it's the thought process behind them as well. So again, that's putting you behind and affecting productivity. So like you said, it's finding what is the best method in terms of this communication. So and often it just isn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if the question is, do you want plain or pepperoni pizza? Fine, I can do that on Slack, no problem, right? But as I said, anything with any kind, I mean, and being in a we're all in knowledge economies, right? Spaces. Most of that stuff isn't just one or two, right? There's all kinds of different possibilities and nuance, and so conversation tends to be, great for that. And then, I mean, that's part of supposedly what made Amazon, which is that supposedly to this day, if you call a meeting, you have to actually write out a briefing about what this meeting is about, right? And it's like a big deal. So they basically set the barrier super high. So you can't just simply dump a meeting onto someone's diary and expect them to be there, right? And I think it's a fairly similar thing we're talking about here with digital communication. It's just that your ability to or someone's ability to just dump a load of work on your plate without, and basically trying to get you to do all the work in getting to someplace isn't right, and I think people actually need to be aware of that, and leadership and management in particular. I do actually think in time we'll actually realize there's a way to conduct these things using these digital tools far more effectively than we do today.
I think it's in a smaller organization, the lines of communication are a lot more open around telephone calls and what have you. When I worked up here for a bank, and the vast majority of the team were down in London or in other parts of the country, there was that receive an email, I've got so much work to do now because someone else is just suddenly planted it on your desk. Here, if one of my team were going to do that, I would expect a phone call, or ideally they would all be in the office together.
What's one manager behavior that you think could help reduce burnout within an organization?
I think it's having an open conversation about the long term and where you want to get to. So you're focusing, you're looking forward and thinking about it rather than having short termism and trying to rush everything.
Yeah. Fab.
So for me, I think what I would say to that is it depends if you are a leader or a manager. Okay, because I would say in general, as a manager, I would be thinking about what are the regular routines of work and of not time off and sort of things that I can repeat to kind of have a kind of dependable rhythm. As a leader, I think it's different because as I mentioned before, as a leader, you will oftentimes be having peak periods of delivery where being on, if you are the Apple CEO, then making sure you're on for those yearly or bi-yearly, big conferences that they do to launch products is clearly probably one of the most important things you can do, right? And so for me, I've stopped trying to think like a manager, i.e. that I'm going to be super dependable and from 9 to 6 every single, all that sort of stuff, and just been like, okay, so we've had a huge conference, it's over. There's usually, a couple weeks of like work that really is important to do after the event. But then you've got to build in time where you are going to, be fallow, if you will, right? And that your commitments are just reduced, and that, you can't just pretend that you can have peak performance all the time, because that's just not possible.
Yeah. And I also think you need to think a bit like an athlete. So if you've got a big event coming up or you've got a big deadline, instead of neglecting everything, are you actually eating to help fuel your body? Like, are you doing are you thinking the way an athlete would, or somebody who has got something really big coming up? Mm-hmm. And often we go the other way, don't we? We start neglecting all of those things when really it's a time when we really, our body and mind need us to really focus on those things.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you both for joining me and opening up the discussion on burnout.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for the invite. Yeah, great to meet you.
Thank you.